Hello and welcome. My name is Jessica Keeney, and I'm the co-chair for the AIA Utah Equity by Design Committee. We are thrilled to have you at our panel. Before we begin, we'd like to thank our sponsors for this conference. So welcome, friends, to the 2021 AIA Utah Connect, Collaborate, Celebrate hybrid conference held digitally and in person here at the AIA Utah headquarters at the Wademan Center in the historic Ford building. We are very grateful to our sponsors for their financial support this year. Thank you to our platinum sponsor, Alder Sales Corporation, our gold sponsors, BHP Structural Engineers, Cogan Construction, Steelcase Midwest Commercial, and Reveille Engineers. Thank you to our silver sponsors, Steel Encounters and Wademan Corporation, and to our print sponsor, SPR Technologies. Now, I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Lisa, who will talk briefly about our committee and introduce our esteemed panelists. Lisa C. Henry holds a Master's of Architecture from Harvard Graduate School of Design and is currently enrolled in a PhD program in English at the University of Utah. She's an associate professor of the School of Architecture at the University of Utah, SOA. Her research is focused on how critical gender, race, queer, and disability theory intersect with architectural education, pedagogy, design, and production. So we're excited to hear more about our committee and about our panelists from Lisa.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm very excited about this new committee and this panel. I'm so excited about our experts. I'm going to start by just introducing the committee and our mission and vision. And then I'm going to go into an introduction of the panel, and then I'll introduce each of our panelists in turn as they speak. And at the end, we'll have some opportunity for question and answer. So the mission and vision of AIA Utah Equity by Design Committee, our mission states to educate the design community on the importance of equitable practices and the value of diverse individuals in order to foster inclusive and equitable environments, processes, and policies, and eliminate explicit and implicit bias in the built environment and in our profession. We want to approach this mission through 4 primary areas. We're looking at forms of knowledge and knowledge resources. The idea here is to empower the AIA and its firms to participate in the process of self-education around issues of equity and justice and the discipline of architecture. The second emphasis is forms of collectivity and practice, which is about enabling through workshops and network development the inclusive representative practitioners. The third emphasis is forms of community and culture that expand the field of practice to include allied fields and community members and forms of activism that contribute to a more inclusive community, including political activism and participation in anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, and anti-homophobic forms of social practice. And finally, to look at forms of design that explore the possibilities of overlooked constituencies and multiple subjectivities. The committee meets on the second Friday of each month at noon. We would love to have you join us in our work. The next meeting, we will be really focused on setting forward priorities for moving forward this work. So all of this mission, it's all a living document. We want to engender a collective form of knowledge building and community building. And so we welcome you to our committee, and we hope to see you there on the next meeting. I don't even know the date, Friday, the October, second Friday in October. All right. So I want to introduce the panel now, Restroom Revolution, Designing Restrooms for Everyone. I'm just going to do a really brief 2-minute introduction of the topic, and then I'll introduce our first speaker, Terry. All right. I'm going to read, because if I don't read, I talk too much. Okay. As I was thinking about how to introduce the topic of public restrooms as an issue of inclusion, I happened to be listening to Code Switch, an NPR podcast hosted by journalists of color and focused on how race impacts every aspect of life in America. In episode 293, What Does It Mean to Be Latino? The Light-Skinned Privilege edition, I heard a moving story of a light-skinned Latinx man standing before 2 bathroom doors. The 2 doors do not say men or women. Instead, they say white or colored. The story tells of how having to make that choice humiliated and disgusted the man. He knew that he would never be considered white in the US, but he also knew of the horror and abuse visited on people of color in this country. Quote, in an act of self-preservation, or complicity or fear, but one that felt deeply deceitful, my father chose privilege and walked into the white bathroom. In that moment, he realized he didn't fit in this country and that maybe he never would, close quote. We later learned that this decision weighed on him throughout most of his life. It impacted his sense of belonging in this country, his sense of dignity, and even his posture when moving through public space. And it lingered so that it was a discussion of conversation even on his deathbed. And listening to the story, I was struck by the intense feelings of anxiety brought on by this choice. The questions about identity, belonging, and erasure that are still confronted by anyone who stands before any dialectic, white, colored, male, female, and has to make a choice where there is no option that feels safe or honest. And of course, we must remember that these choices are made in the face of violence. Throughout the fight for civil rights and the right to public space in this space, this choice has confronted and continues to confront many people. I recognize my own privilege in thoughtlessly choosing a restroom today. I recognize the work and pain of those who have come before me in the movement for civil rights, who have made this possible for me. And I recognize my responsibility to those who are currently confronted with the impossible choice between male and female restrooms that do not reflect the reality of their existence. Those with whom I like to claim solidarity. This mode of exclusion is manifest in the field of architecture, in codes and spaces and buildings. This form of exclusion causes real harm, limiting access to public space, resulting in feelings of erasure and exclusion at best, and violent repercussions in worst cases. This panel is an opportunity to present and discuss the work being done to make change in this critical aspect of inclusion in our built environment. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to three incredible scholars, practitioners, and community members who are working in this area. The first speaker today will be Terry Cogan. Professor Cogan clerked for the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and then practiced law in Boston before joining the law school faculty in 1984. He served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs from 1998 to 2003. Professor Cogan taught in the areas of contracts, copyright law, trust and estates, art, legal philosophy, and sexuality in the law. His most recent scholarship has explored issues related to photography and copyright law. He has spent the last decade considering the rights of transgender people, in particular issues surrounding the legal and cultural norms that mandate segregation in public restrooms by sex. Professor Cogan has been active in gay and transgender politics in Utah and serves on the advisory board of Equity Utah. Professor Cogan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa.
Sorry, before you begin, Terry, I don't know if you can hear me, but I saw a note in the Q&A about sound quality, and someone lifted up the request to move the microphone closer to the speakers if possible.
So you can't hear us? I'm going to put up my first slide. There you go. Great. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I want to thank the AIA Utah for inviting me to participate on this panel. Robin Seb and I will address a growing trend in contemporary architecture, the introduction of inclusive restrooms to public buildings. More specifically, we will explore the growth of all gender multi-user restrooms internationally. I will begin by describing Stahl's successful effort in 2018 to amend the International Plumbing Code to allow for inclusive restrooms. Next slide. So I begin with history. Next slide. To understand how public toilets in America came to be sex separated, we begin at the end of the 18th century. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, the home ceased to be the core economic unit in America. Men left to work in factories, while women remained behind. This economic restructuring of society led to an ideological division between public space and private space, which has become known as the separate spheres ideology. Viewing women as morally virtuous but weak and vulnerable, that ideology posited that the appropriate domain for a woman was in the home, while the proper realm for men was the public sphere where politics and economically productive activity took place. In fact, this sentimental vision of the virtuous woman ensconced in her domestic sphere was a myth, bearing little resemblance to women's actual experiences. From the outset of the 19th century, women began leaving their homes to work in factories, and beyond the workplace, women became important participants in the civic and religious life of the community, and by mid-century had become active consumers in the burgeoning 19th century economy. Next slide. Nonetheless, the separate spheres ideology maintained a tenacious hold on the American imagination. The public realm was considered dangerous for women, and as a result, anxiety accompanied each instance in which a woman ventured into urban streets. Any move by a woman outside of her home was condemned by moralistic ideologues. So how were architects to design public buildings that were inviting to women in an age in which women's very presence in public was looked upon with disdain? The solution was masterful. Architects began designing parlor spaces in public buildings for the exclusive use of women. Ladies' cabins on boats, ladies' dining rooms in hotels, ladies' reading rooms in public libraries, among others. These parlor spaces were ostensibly intended to protect those women who ventured into the public. The practice was a tipping of the hat to the separate spheres ideology, while at the same time was a blatant defying of that ideology by acknowledging that women had become active participants in the public realm. Next slide. The first sex-separated toilets in America were appended to these parlor spaces. Sex-separated toilets appeared on steamships in the early 19th century. These facilities were essentially outhouses that emptied directly into rivers. Next slide. Not long after, sex-separated privies began appearing on boys' playgrounds and girls' playgrounds behind school buildings. Next slide. By the mid-19th century, advances in municipal waterworks allowed sex-separated water closets to be brought indoors in hotels, libraries, and other public buildings. But the practice of separating public restrooms by sex was not enforced by law. It was not until the late 19th century that states began enacting laws to mandate sex-separated toilets in factories and other workplaces. Next slide. The first such law was in Massachusetts. Next slide. The first model building code in the United States was the Uniform Building Code in 1927. Next slide. That code included a requirement that public restrooms be separated by sex. The Uniform Building Code was updated on a 3-year cycle. Over time, the sex separation requirement was expanded to restrooms in virtually all public buildings. Next slide. Fast forward to the present day. The International Plumbing Code is the model code that governs plumbing and sanitation systems in the vast majority of American states and municipalities. Next slide. That code continues to to require that public restrooms be separated by sex. Since the founding of the stalled project, it has been a major goal to amend the IPC to allow for all gender multi-user inclusive restrooms. Next slide. That opportunity arose in 2018 when Stahl joined forces with the National Center for Transgender Equality and the AIA to present a proposed amendment to the separate facilities section of the IPC at the annual meeting of the International Code Council. The amendment was adopted by the council and went into effect in the 2021 revision to the IPC. The final language of the amendment was the result of horse trading among the various constituencies that supported the change. For example, at the first hearing on the proposal, the International Code Council hearing officers insisted on adding the last sentence related to urinals. It wasn't Stahl's preferred form of this amendment, but so be it. Nonetheless, this amendment, which allows for but does not mandate inclusive restrooms in public buildings, paves the way for multi-user, all-gender restrooms across America. But the struggle is not over. As a model code, the IPC only becomes effective in a state or municipality when the governing body formally adopts the change. The next move for Stahl is to lobby local governments to adopt the 2021 revision to the IPC, including the exception to the separate facilities section. Thanks. That's it.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think that should be on our agenda for our committee to start lobbying to have the new building codes adopted. Excellent. Thank you so much. I think that's really important background and understanding for those of us who deal with building codes every day, and leads us into some practical examples from Utah itself. To discuss those examples, I'd like to introduce Robin Burr. Robin is the Chief Facilities Officer at the University of Utah. In this role, she is responsible for campus planning, design and construction, as well as facilities maintenance, operation, and renewal. She leads a team of 600 employees. Prior to joining the U in 2017, Robin worked for Kaiser Permanente, a healthcare provider in California, overseeing teams responsible for design and construction of healthcare facilities. She also has worked as an architect with a practice in higher education and healthcare. She is a licensed architect and has a BA in architecture from UC Berkeley and a master's degree in architecture from Harvard University. Robin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity. All right, you can go right to the next slide. Thank you. So I've been asked today to speak a bit about the University of Utah's efforts around inclusive restroom design, and to talk a little bit about our history. I've been here about a year, and I felt very new at the university still after a year. Could hardly find my way around. I got an email from Terry Cogan in the law school, Terry Cogan, our presenter here, that said, I would like to bring Joel Sanders here from New York to talk about this stalled initiative that you're going to hear next about from Seb Cho. I think that it's an interesting educational opportunity for your staff, for the School of Architecture, and for the law school. So we teamed up, collected some funds, and brought Joel out for a day. And he gave us a presentation on the efforts around more inclusive restroom design that his team has undertaken. And we had a pretty good showing at the meeting, and I was really encouraged to see how excited my staff and project managers were, how interested they were in advancing this as part of the work we do. So 3 of us who came out of that afternoon actually went to then President Ruth Watkins and said, we want to take the university, into where it should be in terms of providing safe and inclusive restrooms for students here. Do you support us? And she said, absolutely, tell me what you need. I'm behind you. I'm willing to stand up and say this is the right thing to do for the university. So this little group was formed that we call the Inclusive Restroom Committee. We'll go to the next slide. So as I noted, our committee began very small. There were just a handful of us from my office, from the LGBT Resource Center, and from Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We quickly got an attorney to join us from the Office of General Counsel. We started doing our work, and our group grew. Every time anyone on campus heard about it, they wanted to be part of it. So you can see that student affairs joined us, housing and residential education joined us. The libraries got involved. They asked to join our group because they wanted to do this in the libraries. So UHealth then, under Ruth's initiative of we are one university, we're not a healthcare campus and a main campus. UHealth joined us, and we now have monthly meetings with this very robust group, like 20 or 30 people. Next slide. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our process, and this is a process I've been able to document in hindsight. We really started in the room saying, okay, where are we? What do we do and how do we get there? So it was a very organic process of finding our way into what we wanted to be and what we thought we could accomplish. So I'll walk you through what are these 8 steps, really starting from learning the rules that Terry talked about. So I'll reiterate a bit to where we are now. Next slide. So first thing we did was work on making sure we understood the rules. And Terry talked a bit about this. When it came to our single stall restrooms, which were scattered about the campus, we didn't really have a problem. We had a lot of restrooms that still said male or female, men's or women's, single stall restrooms that had been gendered, which was a little surprising to all of us. But we knew our first and our easy task would be to take away gender designations from the single stall restrooms. We next wanted to start looking at the opportunities for all gender multi-stall restrooms, and of course ran into the same code issues that Terry mentioned. One is that the International Plumbing Code says that you have to have separate facilities for each sex, and also that you have to have a sign on the door that says male or female. So those were the first 2 obstacles with the code. And as Terry noted, the 2021 International Plumbing Code allows an option for an all-gender multi-stall restroom. The challenge in Utah will be that there will be a lengthy review process by the state legislature to adopt that code, and every state has the right to amend a code before they adopt it, right? So Utah, in theory, could say we will strike that. We have no idea and no reason to know which way they will go, but that's the obstacle here in Utah. Next slide. So we began with the task that we knew would be relatively easy, which is finding our 150 single stall restrooms on campus and doing 2 things. 1, degendering them, and 2, making sure that our signage was consistent. We had a lot of very robust discussions about what the sign should say. Terry was part of those discussions as a member of our committee. And we talked about whether it should say all gender, whether it should say restroom, what it should say. And in the end, we came to the conclusion that we should really just talk about what's in the room, right? Does it have a toilet, a sink, a urinal, a shower, a baby changing station, and is it accessible? So next slide. So the next thing was to figure out how to actually update the signage on all of these restrooms. And so the LGBT Resource Center director at the time offered to have a pizza party, invite everyone who comes to the center. If facilities would come and help teach them how to go out and inventory what restrooms we had and what was in them. And I put a little snippet of the spreadsheet we started, but we had a mile-long spreadsheet of our hundreds of buildings. And we sent the students out to figure out, where the restrooms were, what the door number was, where it sat in the building, what it was designated as now, and how big was the existing sign. We had them take pictures of the signage because we knew that in every building we would have to match the signage that went with them. And we had them check every fixture that was in the station, in the restroom. It was a very lengthy process. It took a lot of go-rounds. We are at we're 100% surveyed, and I think 90 or 95% installed on these signs. We made them in our facilities sign shop. It was a very laborious process because we had newer buildings like the law school that had quite beautiful signage, and we had to make sure that we matched their standard, and old buildings with old signage. But we did this with a grant from the university chief financial officer as well as from facilities. So we accomplished this. It's taken us a couple of years and about $15,000. Next slide. Just wanted to show you this great tool we have. On the university website, there is a site, maps.utah.edu, where you can pull up the campus map. You can click on buildings and it will tell you the building number and the name and who's in it. There's also this category called accessibility and safety, where you can go turn on features. And one of the features you can turn on under accessibility and safety is all gender restrooms, meaning the single stall restrooms. I didn't even know this existed, but this is something that the LGBT Resource Center has created and maintained. They've had students go out and update this annually, which is a tremendous tool. But what they told us is that the reason this is so important is because students came to them terrified about not knowing where they could go to the bathroom and feel safe, and really feeling a strong need to know in which buildings they could find a single stall restroom. Next stall. So the next thing we did was we decided to design a restroom design standard for the university. And we basically created a mandate all on our own that every new building, new restroom, or renovated restroom was going to have to comply with this design standard. And, what you see now, what you see in this picture is a restroom that's divided in two with one side could be designated male, one female to comply with the current code. But if you look at the partition between them that runs from the sink wall to the toilet stall wall, that partition in new buildings is really a piece of storefront or a window frame with a panel in it, so that when we have the opportunity to make them all gender multi-stall, we simply have to unbolt that from the wall and patch the holes in the wall. But some other things the committee came up with that they felt were important were really more about dealing with the perceived sense of insecurity, the kind of fears you hear about in news stories that promote, I don't want my daughter in a restroom with a man or whatever it is. We decided that we would make sure that there were multiple ways in and out, no dead ends, so that no one could ever say that they felt they could be trapped in the restroom. And if you look at this, you could get out one side or the other, and there are no doors out into the hallway. The restroom stalls themselves have full height partitions and doors. We build them where we have space more like rooms, right? So they function kind of like a single stall restroom, just without the sink. We said no urinals. This has been a topic of discussion every time we have a plan review, but the committee is very adamant that we don't want to create any sense of inequity or difference, where that people can't use any stall they want. We made the decision the sanitary napkins go in every stall. And as I noted earlier, that there is this wall between the restroom, the two gendered restrooms that can be easily removed. Next slide. So the next thing we did is we implemented a design review process. So we first went to our project managers, who are mostly architects and engineers who hire architects and manage projects from plant programming through completion. And we trained them on this new standard and basically said, this is how you will design from here on at the University of Utah. We also mandated that every project in design that either was providing new restrooms or renovated restrooms would come to this committee that's scheduled to meet monthly, present their plans and get feedback. So we're now reviewing every newly designed restroom floor plan on campus that has more than one stall in it. We're also beginning to review locker rooms that happen to have restrooms and showers in them, with the goals of doing all the things that we talked about in the last slide, making sure that it was safe and comfortable and could easily convert to an all-gender multi-stall restroom. Next slide. So the next obvious task is that we really wanted to build some all-gender multi-stall restrooms now, and we didn't want to wait for Utah to adopt the code. We knew we had President Watkins' support at the time and believe we have President Randall's support now. Additionally, the Utah State Board of Higher Education has made equity, diversity, and inclusion their #1 goal. Don't know what that means, but that is their stated goal if you go to their website. So that's a really good sign. So we went to our code official and said, what can you do to help us be able to build all-gender multi-stall restrooms now? He did some research, talked to our plan review group, and determined that he can't really change the code, but he can draft an interpretation of the code as the code official for the University of Utah. We are separate from Salt Lake City. We have our own code official in our own jurisdiction. And he wrote his interpretation of the code based on the university's non-discrimination policy that basically says that the university commits to providing and fostering a campus environment that is safe and free from discrimination, which in his mind and ours meant that you had to allow people to feel safe when they went into the restroom. Next slide. All right, so our next step was to begin to work within this code interpretation. We went back to the president's office and asked for money to build an all-gender multi-stall restroom on the 4th floor of the Student Union, which is a great place to begin because it is where the LGBT Resource Center sits, as well as the Women and Children's Resource Center, the Women's Resource Center. And we were able to collect the funding through it. We got a grant from the ASUU, which is the Associated Students of the University of Utah. They gave us a $10,000 grant last spring. The Bastion Foundation, through Terry's efforts, also gave us a grant. And then the University Office of the President has provided the rest of the funding. And I'm going to show you pictures in a minute, but we are in code review and getting ready to start construction on our first all-gender multi-stall restroom. As we were going through this process, the Marriott Library, who had a member join our team, said they wanted to do it too. They had funding for restroom renewal this year, and so they began design an all-gender multi-stall restroom that will sit on the main floor of the Marriott Library. They are in design at this moment. Next slide. Just going to show you some pictures. This is the Union 4th floor restroom. We took out a male restroom, a female restroom, and a single stall restroom to gather enough space to build this. The space is really narrow. It caused us a lot of challenge to try to fit in a gracious restroom with enough openness to feel comfortable and meet our requirements. The back wall is a masonry wall. The front wall is an egress corridor, so we were bound by those dimensions. But what you'll see is that we built single stall rooms, we built a sink area, and if you look into the photographs, what you'll see is that rather than full height doors into the hallway, we're using what I call parlor or saloon doors. that are just swing 180 degrees. They're translucent. So you can see feet, you can see silhouette through, just to give people a little bit of a sense of privacy when they're standing at the sink. We're very excited about this. I think that we will start construction in a couple of months and be open by the end of the year here. Next slide. Next slide are our initial drawings for the Marriott Library restroom. If you look up on the upper right hand corner, you can see the schematic design there. In this restroom, we really only had one way in and out because we had a janitor's closet in the way, and so that was one of the things we weren't able to achieve, was 2 ways out. But in this restroom, you have the opportunity to create a loop and to put in a sink that will actually be lower, so you can actually see over the top of the sink. Yeah, you can see it if you look down in the lower left side. The middle elevation shows the sink on the right side. So you can see that once you're in that restroom, you'll be able to see right over the sink. The architect has put full-length mirrors at a couple other places in the restroom so that people have that opportunity to comb their hair or adjust their collar before they leave the room, but it's not the sink area anymore. Next slide. So that is really where we are in a couple of years of great dialogue and good work and good support from university leadership. As we have sat as a group and said, what's next? It's really the students who have said to us, we don't just want to be an inclusive restroom committee, we want to be an inclusive space committee. So that's our next challenge, and we've started kind of thinking about what our mission statement should be, what kind of space we should be looking at. The university does maintain design standards. It doesn't go as far as being room templates or anything prescriptive about spaces. But as a committee, we're now just beginning to talk about, we've created what we think is a really successful system for restrooms and are very excited about where we go from here. And limits there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. All right, and we have the final member of our panel here is Seb Che. I hope I said that correctly. Seb Che is an associate director at JSA and Mixed Design, a New York-based office comprised of JSA, a full-service architecture firm, and Mixed Design, a branch of the firm that serves as an inclusive design think tank and agency. Mixed Design is dedicated to making public spaces and everyday building types like restrooms, university campuses, workplaces, and art museums accessible and welcoming to people of different ages, genders, races, religions, and abilities. As project manager for Stalled, an award-winning initiative for inclusive restrooms, and Mixed Museum, a new initiative that collaborates with partner museums to transform key areas of the visitor experience. Che oversees research and design teams, organizes lectures and workshops, and disseminates work through publication in print and online formats. Thank you, Seb, for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay over there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I see nods. Cool. Let me start sharing my screen and let me know, give me some more nods if it looks good from your end.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, seeing more nods. Okay, fantastic. Well, welcome to this virtual space that we're commuting in together. Happy to tune in. I'm calling from Brooklyn, New York today, and happy to be tuned in virtually to Utah. And so inspiring to hear Terry and Robin's presentations, because I remember in 2018 when we were preparing the workshop for University of Utah, really at the beginning of the process that Robin was describing, and to see kind of it come around full circle, to see so much progress is really amazing. And I really hope that that PowerPoint that you just shared, Robin, ends up being open source, because I can tell you after doing workshops at almost 40 university campuses across the country, we really haven't seen any universities have such a robust process as Utah's has. And it's incredibly inspiring. And I think even the most elite universities that you would think would be ahead, can't hold a candle to what you've accomplished. So hats off to you all. So Yeah, just to kick it off, thanks to Lisa Henry and Jessica Simmons for bringing me on to this Equity by Design kind of event around the Utah conference, and great to share the stage with Terry, who's been a colleague for many years in this kind of field of restroom advocacy. Again, I'm Seb Che. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the Associate Director at JSA Mixed Design. And in the spirit of the Equity by Design Committee mission statement, I just wanted to acknowledge, though I'm not there on that land today, to acknowledge and honor the land that's been traditionally stewarded by the Ute tribe of Utah, as well as the Shoshone, Paiute, and Goshute tribes in that ancestral homeland. And in the spirit of inclusivity and a future of Native sovereignty, I'll be donating a 25% portion of my speaker fee to the Red Nation, which is a really amazing group working on Native sovereignty projects. So to kick off a little bit about our office, JSA Mixed Design is composed of two branches, which was just shared with both of you. On the left-hand side is JSA, our architecture studio, and on the right-hand side is Mixed Design, which I'll be talking a bit more about today, which serves as the inclusive design think tank and consultancy. This slide just shows a short constellation of some of the many members on our team. It's much broader than this, of course, but we wanted to show this because to meet the unique goals of each project, we assembled different teams. We have an in-house staff, we have a board of advisors, we have a network of consultants, and we really try to bring in experts from design, diversity and inclusion, as well as policy to tackle different problems and get different cultural, historical, and technical perspectives into the room. That being said, I want to say that we do this work because we've inherited a legacy of exclusion in architecture. Buildings have been designed based on dimensions from measuring the characteristics of the quote unquote normal body, one that's often portrayed to be white, able-bodied, cisgender, and male. And this ergonomic data continues to haunt the standards and regulatory codes that govern architecture today. So we celebrate and build upon the disability rights movement's work to create laws like the ADA. But again, these accommodations can focus on wheelchair users alone, manifesting as separate ADA ramps and entrances as depicted here. And while it's an amazing start, it can potentially stigmatize those with special needs. So what we do in the office is work to transform access barriers into design opportunities that can allow a broad spectrum of different people to mix in public space, hence our name, Mixed Design. And this intersectional approach was inspired originally by our work around restroom access, but we've cast a wider net to think not only of gender minorities, but people with mobility challenges, people who are blind or low vision, deaf and hard of hearing people, people on the autism spectrum or who identify as neurodiverse, and people with specific religious needs like Muslim folks who perform ablutions or pre-prayer washings, or Orthodox Jewish people who require gender separation in certain activities. And architects, can't tackle all of this alone. We advocate for the active participation of stakeholders like the University of Utah, that amazing list of committees that you saw, as well as the day-to-day and users that use the building, like the students, that you got on board to survey the restrooms at the pizza party, to provide valuable insights from the lived experience of the built environment. So a bottom-up approach that can ensure that those who are most impacted have a seat at the decision-making table. And these are some images from workshops that we've conducted at Mixed Design. I won't go too deep into this diagram. There's more on our website if you're interested, but we use a methodology portrayed here to think about the different specific needs of end user groups, knowing, of course, that there's overlaps between these, shown in the age, gender bubbles seen on the left-hand side. For this drawing, we were thinking about restrooms. We were thinking, what are the actual activities we're performing? Grooming, washing, caregiving, eliminating. And we try to think about how we can resolve the needs of people as well as the needs to perform these activities into design solutions and specifications that can make sure all those needs are met. And that will kind of segue into how we begin to put these principles into practice through different initiatives for different building types. I'll mainly talk about STALLed, which is our project around restrooms, and then close talking about our work with museums. But STALLed, as Terry mentioned, was started in 2015 in regards to the national controversies and panic around transgender access to public restrooms. These so-called transgender bathroom wars centered around bathroom bills that would force trans people to use the restrooms aligned with the sex designated on our birth certificates. But as we began to get more deep into the research, we realized that restroom controversies are by no means new. Terry covered some of this, and this was also talked about in the introduction in terms of colored restrooms, but the restroom has historically been a crucible registering different anxieties about groups on the margins moving more into mainstream society. These include the separate ladies' room that Terry was talking about with the parlors as women were entering the workplace, the fight to abolish colored bathrooms during the civil rights movement in the 80s and 90s, the fear of contamination by gay men during the AIDS crisis in public restrooms, and the fight by the disability rights movement to make public bathrooms wheelchair accessible. So in each instance, you see the restroom being a physical space that transforms this fear into a real tangible nightmare where normal citizens are compelled to interact with others in a tight space where before they might not have had to interact with these people. And this kind of brings us to today with the Transgressor Wars in terms of how trans, non-binary, intersex, and gender non-conforming people demonstrate that there are many ways of expressing gender independent from biological sex that don't conform to the binary of sex-segregated restrooms that we've become accustomed to as the status quo. But that's not to say that they've always been that way, as Terry showed us. And this animation will show us our general process for how we have created our design principles and its design around restrooms. And it's very, very similar to what Robin was describing. But we start with the existing footprint dictated by typical back-to-back sex-segregated restrooms. We remove the binary wall, treating the restrooms as an open space. We remove the corridor wall and the bathroom doors. The bathroom then has added 2 blocks of fully enclosed stalls, floor to ceiling, of different sizes, including caregiving rooms with toilets, sinks, and changing tables, as well as communal grooming and washing stations off the circulation path. We also add a lounge in this prototype that activates the corridor into an animated social space. So we think this increases safety by consolidating a greater amount of eyes to monitor the space, look out for each other, and minimize harassment and violence, as well as provide a non-binary option for people who now don't have to choose between 2 options, male or female, that don't align with our identities. We've put this into practice and built projects at Gallaudet University, which is very similar to the animation that we were just showing here, a school for the deaf in Washington, DC, as well as more speculative prototypes for more high traffic spaces like an airport concourse, which here we treat like an open agora-like precinct adjacent to the gates where you might be waiting for your flight, with 3 parallel activity zones dedicated to grooming, washing, and eliminating. This drawing shows how users can circulate in this model from one station to the next, from the outermost grooming station to the innermost toilet wall, experiencing a gradient that takes them from public to private, open to closed, smooth to coarse, dry to wet, acoustically reverberant to sound absorptive, and from ambient to spotlighting. And while we were doing all this work, we began to collaborate with partners in public health. And that helped us realize the extent to which currently status quo male, female restrooms fail to meet the needs not only of trans people, but many, many different people shown in the matrix here. This includes people that use colostomy bags, Muslims performing pre-prayer washings, parents taking care of differently gendered children, or caregiving for an elder, for autistic and neurodiverse visitors. The list kind of goes on. So as the years have been going by, we've been working to update our designs to accommodate a wider net of end users. So this drawing here shows one of these prototypes that we have in the works. In this case, we're thinking about transforming the entry sequence of a university building to really integrate restroom and kind of bodily care. In this case, we call it a wellness hub, into the reception area of a public building, and think about how we can learn from user groups like deaf folks, wheelchair users, and autistic people to think about alternative forms of wayfinding that help you find your destination in a much more intuitive way that can also incorporate lessons learned from the pandemic in terms of how can design help you understand where you're going, your relation to other people, to avoid unwanted collisions that could potentially compromise hygiene and health. But you can tell from the zoomed in version of that drawing here that really the core of this area is this wellness hub or expanded restroom, which includes full privacy stalls, hands-free communal sinks and toilets, as well as smaller rooms for caregiving or prayer, as well as escape spaces for people with autism who need a quiet, private space to take a break from sensory overstimulation. And that's to say that when we were making this presentation 6 years ago, many people were on board in theory, but we found that clients weren't willing to make those investments straight away to begin transforming their restrooms. And this was obviously deterred by the plumbing code, which was restricting this kind of imagination. But with the events of 2020, pushing institutions and companies to invest more seriously in social justice, we're seeing many more built examples of inclusive restrooms of this type emerge, like the one that Robin showed at University of Utah, and some at the universities depicted here at Carnegie Mellon and Princeton University, which our office is working on. And I'll close my presentation by briefly sharing this other initiative called Mixed Museum and pivot to thinking about art museums and how we are applying this methodology to buildings outside of restrooms, very similar to what Robin was signaling to at the end of her presentation, saying, is the Inclusive Restroom Committee going to become an inclusive space committee? And yes, there's so many lessons that we can learn from this transformation to other building types. This drawing shown here shows the standard hanging height of paintings and how this assumes a very certain eye level of height, which doesn't work for wheelchair users or children or people with dwarfism. And we were really ignited by the desire to look at how museums have historically excluded certain people and how museums can meet their goals today of being more inclusive to their communities. So to that end, we partnered with the Queens Museum, a massive public institution here in New York City, and worked with small grants to collaborate with grad students in architecture as well as public health and their staff to begin rethinking their building through an inclusive design lens. The central atrium pictured here on this slide poses challenges for many visitors in Queens. They get a lot of large school groups. They have a lot of elderly and disabled visitors, children who are neurodiverse or autistic, as well as many non-native English speakers, as Queens is the most diverse borough in the country. So with a lot of signage being primarily in English, this can restrict access to many people who might be able to use the building itself to navigate spaces in a more intuitive way. So we received a grant last year from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to partner with Queens residents towards this mission. So we've recruited an access cohort, is what we call it, with a nonprofit called Queens Community House that reflects the audience that we want to attract, that we're working together to critique the building and start thinking of some transformative alternatives at different scales, low, medium, and high, some of which can be implemented tomorrow, others which can be fundraised for future renovation projects. And I'll add here that something is that beyond the kind of flashy inclusive design prototypes or speculative drawings, something that we've really learned is that access at a kind of meta level is extremely important to advocate for in the inclusive design process. Just getting these people together, printing out stipends for them, organizing Ubers, calling people who don't have access to email, and gathering people into a space to do an inclusive design audit is labor of love and requires a lot of resources. And it's something we're realizing we really want to advocate for in all architecture projects, the kind of pre-concept phase that has post-occupancy analysis or inclusive design review of whatever space you might be looking at. So we're in the process, actually, we have another workshop this Saturday of continuing this series of workshops with the access cohort to start dreaming up more inclusive versions of the Queens Museum building. And I think I'm at my time, so I'll close here, but I'll say that designing through the lens of voices on the margins can be a catalyst for creativity, as I hope to have expressed here. And our collaborator in mixed design, Magda Mustafa, always says, when you design for the extreme condition, we all benefit. And that's the spirit that we try to follow. So thank you.
Excellent. I'm so excited about all of the information that has been presented here today, from the basics of the code and how codes impact the lives of people to the restrooms in Utah and the fact that Utah is doing a great job and pioneering in this field, and to Seb's expansion of those principles of, I love the idea of the access cohort and the catalyst, that understanding access as a catalyst for creativity. to expand these issues beyond restrooms into spaces more broadly. I believe we have a few moments left. If anybody has any questions, you have any questions in the room, or I guess. Yes.
What are some ways that we can encourage the codes to be adopted? Can we contact the legislature? How can we encourage that to be something that takes those shackles off of us that are preventing us from moving forward?
Just for those on Zoom that may not have heard that, the question was, what are some ways that we can encourage change in the laws, lobby our legislature so that we can remove the shackles that are currently on us and really move forward with this initiative for inclusive design?
So this is an extremely sensitive issue. Which deserves a lot more discussion before any steps are taken. But the tradition in many jurisdictions is the International Code Council will adopt amendments to one of its many codes, including the plumbing code. The amendments generally will take place 2 or 3 years after they're adopted. And from that point on, it is open to state legislatures or municipalities to accept the changes. What happens in many instances is someone will simply, so Utah's building code adopts the International Code Council's building code. And someone will simply make a motion that we move to now adopt the latest building code. And there's something to be said for that level of, in a sense, abstraction to simply encourage the legislature to do what it's always done, which is basically 2 years after the new code comes out, they adopt it with a few changes. So the strategy issue is, and it's a difficult one, we want to point out that this is included in the new code, or do we simply want to encourage that once again, Utah make its building code up to date by adopting the new version of the code? No simple answer.
And I would say the answer from the University of Utah's perspective is that we plan to open 2 inclusive restrooms in the next year. While I've been encouraging, like, let's not make a lot of fanfare about it, let's just say we're doing this because it complies with our non-discrimination code and see how it's perceived. Because I think once people realize that it actually serves everyone better and it's no big deal, then we can go start pulling those partitions out of all these bathrooms we've built with a little piece of storefront in the middle and do it without any fanfare. Because I, like Terry, have some concern about the more this becomes publicized what we're doing, the more risk we are in being shut down.
Yes.
I've got a question to read here from the Q&A. This is from Julia Oderda. And she says, I am so excited that this topic is gaining more prevalence in architectural spheres. The speakers were all fantastic and the work of Stahl has really paved the way. Before I get to the question, I want to make a plea from an architect and a transgender woman. We need voices to help ensure the changes to the IPC are not removed from the code by the legislature. We need the weight of the AIA and everyone as individuals to help make that happen. All the same misogynistic philosophy Terry talked about is driving all of the anti-transgender laws that are being proposed all around the country, including here in Utah. The trans community needs additional voices to fight anti-transgender laws before they can harm more people. Any suggestions for encouraging clients to thinking more inclusively from the beginning of design?
Yeah, I would love to respond to that question, which I think is really great. And I think aligns closely with the question that I answered in the chat, but we'll repeat because it aligns from Gary, who was talking about how to fight these old stereotypes of what a restroom is and implementing this in schools. And to Gary, I responded that it really depends on who your audience is that you're advocating with. But for schools specifically, I shared a resource from the Cunningham Group, an architectural firm who successfully implemented this multi-user type in K through 12 schools, and also done post-occupancy analyses that have generated metrics and data showing that it increased both the feelings of physical safety and emotional comfort and anxiety of the students. So I think once people are doing it, they're realizing that it's really no big deal, kind of exactly what Robin's saying, and they get used to it pretty quickly. But specifically to Julia's question, I think there's a change in culture and it's geographically specific. You know, when we would give this talk years ago, I was having to call people from different facilities departments across the country and no one wanted to hear about it. And then now our office's phone is kind of ringing off the hook as everyone's realizing, you know, they really need to address this issue more seriously. So I think it depends on what audience you're trying to reach. Some people will respond better to metrics and data. Some people respond more to questions of productivity or capital. So if it's a workplace, you might want to say that, you know, not having to go out of your way and wait in a restroom line forever will increase productivity and general mental health of your employees. For universities, you can make the argument that if you want to attract a more diverse student body, this is the way to do it, or you don't want to lose people from your staff. So I think it really depends, but I think you kind of have to craft your argument towards the client that you're working with. And I feel like there are different buttons to press. What we've often tried to do is think about, let's get the restroom up to date to the 21st century. No one likes these restrooms as they are currently. You know, it's not just about the gender issue, but by doing this, we can address all these other issues as well, that you're not meeting the needs of people with disabilities or these other people. And once you kind of broaden the conversation to include many other people where they can maybe relate more, like, oh, I've had to take my elderly mother to the restroom before and it was awkward, or I've had to take, you know, people just start to get it, I think, once you really outline all the problems that there are with the existing model.
Just to emphasize the point that Seb just made, and Seb was instrumental, I think, in getting the stalled project to broaden its vision of restrooms. When we first started, our focus really was on issues of transgender rights. And over the next 2 or 3 years, we realized that as a talking matter, there are other communities that can also benefit greatly from all gender multi-user restrooms. And that in a sense, with respect to restrooms, in no way do we diminish the need of trans people for safe restrooms, but to the extent we can include the trans community with other communities, the disability community, the elderly community, parents, etc., the negative reaction that one might have to an all-gender restroom diminishes. That we are trying to encompass a broad community of people, part of whom, an important part of whom, are trans people.
I did a project with students, a public restroom project with students. We started with restroom horror stories. Everyone has a restroom horror story where they went into a public restroom and it didn't work for them, or it was terrifying, or it was uncomfortable, it was awkward. And we come to see that no matter who we are across all of our differences, restrooms don't work for most people, right? The way current restrooms are designed, they do not work for most people. And I think if we start there, absolutely, it's not that we want to erase the more controversial issues of trans rights, but it's that we want to set them in a context that's much broader and understand that making changes, if we use that as a catalyst for creativity, as Seb said, we make changes that benefit everybody and not just a singular community. And certainly with the history of restrooms and how they've impacted so many communities and their rights to public space, I think that's a really good way to have that conversation. Do we have additional
I've
questions?
got 2 comments from our local friends here. R.K. Stewart, saying, excellent panel, valuable information presented exceedingly well. Thank you. And one more from our dean up at the College of Architecture and Planning. Just want to read his comments. This is utterly fascinating. Thanks to the panelists. I love the wellness hub idea. Thank you all for advocating for how creativity and architecture is proving critical to furthering belonging in our society. No questions, just kudos.
All right, excellent, thank you. Did you have a comment, Seth, that you wanted to say? I thought.
Oh, no, yeah, just very briefly was that I feel like sometimes when I share that timeline of the different user groups, I feel like a timeline can sometimes like evoke the notion that we've solved these problems. And of course, we haven't, like restrooms are still an issue for many cis women, that didn't conclude in the 1880s. And something that we often talk about for inclusive restrooms is the wait times for women and how this is totally inequitable in many spaces, and how an inclusive restroom where anyone can use every stall immediately makes the wait times more equitable. So it's just, I just wanted to bolster your point that the goal isn't to flatten or neutralize, needs of trans people, but to realize that, architecture can be, resolved to serve many more people.
We're done, okay. To respect everyone's time, we are gonna call the end of the panel at this point. I really will encourage everyone to join us for our Equity by Design committee, so we can continue this conversation and continue to push our creativity towards equitable inclusion for everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists. It was an excellent discussion, an excellent panel, and I feel like we've all learned a lot today, myself included. Thank you so much.